You've probably heard of vegetarian and vegan diets, but have you ever heard of a carnivore diet? Today's guest heretic, Dr. Shawn Baker, will share his experience with eating just meat, and we'll learn should you be leaning more towards the carnivore side of the food plate. What are the ups and downs of such a regimen, and why are there so many ex-vegans in the carnivore camp? That's coming up next on the Nutrition Heretic podcast.
Meet Gina. Gina wanted to lose weight, so she spent 2 years fasting, detoxing, and dabbling with vegan diets while practicing a shit ton of yoga to lose 25 pounds. But it took so long that nobody noticed. Then, Gina started Frenching her food by eating fatty cheeses, butter, sausages, and red meat, and lost 15 more pounds in only 2 months. Everybody noticed this time. Frenching your food unlocks the riddle of weight loss that skinny French chicks use to slim down, look young, and live longer despite doing everything wrong. Be like Gina. Start Frenching your food today by visiting nutritionheretic.com/Frenching.
Fat is bad for you.
I just pop a pill and I'm fine.
Meat is murder.
It's time for bad food punishment. It's time for real nourishment. It's time for the Nutrition Heretic.
The following program is provided as information only and may not be construed as medical or health advice. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease. No action or inaction should be taken solely on the basis of the information provided here. Please consult with a licensed healthcare professional or doctor on any matter relating to your health and well-being.
Aloha and welcome to the Nutrition Heretic podcast. This is Adrienne Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic, today talking about the latest diet sweeping the vegan nation. And you know it is. Let me give you the background on this. You guys have heard me say before that there's so much bashing of the animal products, and when you really dissect every food, you can find something wrong with it if you so choose. From an apple to broccoli to really, flax seeds, it doesn't matter. You're going to find something nasty in there, something you don't like. And I know that we've talked before about anti-nutrients, things that work against us. This is one of the reasons why people can't eat nightshades, for example, particularly if they have arthritic conditions. So a couple months ago, a friend of mine told me about some other friends of ours locally who were doing this carnivore diet. And she's like, I don't think I could do it. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds kind of rough. But then I saw them and actually these guys were telling me about the virtues of the vegan diet. And, but now they're carnivores. And this is beyond paleo. It's beyond keto. It's zero carb. It's 100% meat. And that brings us to today's guest heretic, which was the driving force and influence on my friends. Their skin is clear. Their skin is nice and tight, nice and tight, like they're 20 years old, but they're not. And so this is our guest heretic today is Shawn Baker. Welcome to the show, Shawn.
Adrienne, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
So, am I right or am I right? I've been since I learned about you, I've been kind of going in a lot of carnivore groups on Facebook. There's a lot of vegans in there.
There are a lot of
former vegans, I should say.
There's a lot of former vegans. Yeah, there's definitely that. In fact, I even have a group specially dedicated called the Restoration Health Vegan Recovery Group. We've got 1,000 members of ex-vegans that have switched out of veganism, and some of them are doing a purely carnivorous diet. Some of them are just back to including meat back in their diet because they had problems with the vegan diet. But there's no shortage of that. It's kind of funny because obviously this is not your typical diet. It is, what many people would consider very, very extreme, particularly relative to what most of us eat today in modern Western society.
Sure.
Now, whether it's extreme to all people on Earth at all times, I would argue that that's not the case. You could probably go to rural Mongolia 50 years ago, and they would probably say, yeah, that was carnivore diet. Yeah, that was Tuesday. That was pretty typical for a lot of people. And so, but a lot of people that are attracted to veganism, they do. That's also an extreme diet. So they already have this sort of personality type that says, I'm willing to do extreme things to see what happens. And so when that doesn't help them, for those that it doesn't help, and it helps some, doesn't help them all, but the ones that doesn't work for, they're, well, I'm going to try the next extreme thing. And so a lot of them end up on a carnivore diet. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And there was one woman in particular, I remember, she was an ex-vegan and she lived with her vegan sister. And so she's doing zero carb. Her sister's doing all carb. And she just was lamenting, the constant headbutts the two of them were having in the kitchen.
Well, I mean, again, I think it could be complementary. If you go to a restaurant, you eat the sides and I'll eat the steak type of thing. But
sure.
I mean, there's obviously some ethical overtones in that may not jibe well. But I mean, as far as, can they get along symbiotically? I think it might work out well. One eats you eat this stuff and I'll eat that stuff, and it works out pretty well. So, but yeah, it's definitely a radical departure from what most of us are used to. This show, The Nutritional Heretic, obviously it's considered heresy. If you would have asked me about a carnivore diet 3 years ago, I would have said that's pretty darn crazy. And until I did it, and have done it for 2 years now, and have come to a very different conclusion.
Right. Well, I saw Alpha, if that means anything to you.
Yeah, I saw that movie twice and took both my kids, and I thought that was a wonderful movie. I was like, look at that. For you guys that don't know, it was a wonderful movie about, it's just a good movie, but it sort of has a sort of an artistic impression of what life was like for man, 20, 30,000 years ago in Ice Age Europe. And I think there's probably some pretty decent historical accuracy there based on what I've read if you watch the movie.
Right.
And as you notice, there weren't Whole Foods stores there. There weren't blueberries and avocados and bananas
exactly
where they were hanging out. So, anyway.
Right. My take, I have a couple of different things as far as my take on where the fruits and vegetables lie in our diet. But before I get into that, and maybe we won't get into it, but one thing that I'm hearing from you that I don't hear from a lot of the advocates is that you don't, or at least you're not coming across as being particularly dogmatic about this. Where I'm hearing a lot of the same kind of angst, if you will, particularly from many of the former vegans, like you were saying, they're, used to being on these radical, kind of extreme diets. I'm seeing a lot of people bashing other people for not being carnivore enough, and that everybody needs to be on this if they ever hope to live a decent life. And I'm not hearing that from the way you're talking. Do you think that most people, will benefit? And if so, are you on a mission to change everybody to do this?
No, I think it's an option. I think it's an option for people. I don't think, despite what, some people, I don't think it's particularly dangerous. I don't think anyone's going to die from eating ribeye steaks for 3 months, to try and see how it does for them. So I think that's certainly fair to say that, as a physician, because my background is as a physician. So I come into this looking at seeing people, getting better from some really bad diseases. We're seeing a number of people with, pretty significant, particularly autoimmune diseases, where those things get better, which is not typically the case. Most of the time these people are put on immunosuppressive drugs, corticosteroids. They're very expensive. They don't work very well. They're side effect prone. But we're not, we're seeing people with, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, asthma, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, all these things getting significantly better in the diet. So I'm really interested from that perspective. And so I think you can use it as a tool to try to help yourself and heal yourself. And then many people that do the diet will find that, they get better physically. And a lot of this probably has to do with gut permeability. That's what the little science we have around it now sort of indicates that it probably helps significantly with gut permeability. And so once your gut permeability has been restored to normal, to what it was when you were born or when you were a kid, then you probably have a greater capacity to deal with some of these other foods. And so I actually encourage people, or I shouldn't say I encourage, I don't discourage people from adding other foods back into the diet once they've kind of solved those problems. There are plenty of people, people have been criticizing me for saying, well, why don't you tell everybody to eat a balanced diet? I said, there are plenty of people out there that can tell you how to eat a balanced diet. That's not what I'm about. I'm about, this is how you do this particular diet. Use it as a tool. If it works for you, well, great. I'm glad it worked for you. If you want to stay on it, that's fine. If you want to go back to something a little more moderate, that's also fine. But what I found in practicality is the vast majority of people that try this diet will find that they see some sort of health improvement. Most of them do. Some people don't, but most do. The vast majority of the people will end up, after a period of time, stepping away from the diet. But what they will find out is they kind of stay carnivore-ish. They find out and they discover that, meat is a very important part of the diet. Eating a lot of it tends to make them feel better, and so they'll say they'll be kind of, somebody's coined the term carnivore adjacent, where they they mostly eat meat, but then they'll throw in some berries here and there, some avocados here and there, or this and that, and I think that's totally fine as well. I'm not, like I said, I'm not dogmatic about it, but I do think more than anything, this represents, here's a problem. We've always said, not always, but for about the last maybe 100 years or so, we've really kind of had meat in the crosshairs as being this awful food. This food we've eaten for arguably 2.5 million years or longer.
Compared to grains and vegetables, right?
Yeah, right. Is now, here, think about this. When human beings adopted a grain-based diet, circa around 10,000 years ago, it varies on place to place, but approximately then, we didn't do randomized control trials to say, is eating grain in the human diet now a good thing? We didn't do that. We just did it out of necessity because we ran out of food. I mean, we ran out of these big megafaunal animals that went extinct, so we didn't have those to eat anymore. So we had to get our nutrition from somewhere. And so once we adopted a grain-based diet, we ended. And if you look at the anthropological record, we see that human beings became not as robust. I mean, we shrunk by about 6 inches on average. Our bones became thinner. Our muscle attachments became smaller. Our brains actually became about 200 cc's smaller, which I don't know that most people know that, but that's pretty clear in the fossil record. So, it was arguably a detriment to the human health, and so, but we just did that because we had to. It's like they weren't expensive, and we've just accepted that for the last 10,000 years because that's what we've known. And so now we just assume it's normal because that's what we've always done for, you and I know what our parents ate and what our grandparents ate, and that's about it. But, if I were to go back 200 years ago, there weren't Twinkies, there weren't Cheetos, there wasn't Crisco, there was, you didn't have 6,000 foods to choose from. Even 200 years ago, you might have had, because you didn't even have refrigerators, so you only had a handful of local foods you could have eaten because there wasn't mass transport. So then our food variety was very limited. But then if you go back even further, if we keep pushing the clock back, now we're back before agriculture. Now all we've got is wild animals, some berries, maybe some roots and stuff like that, maybe some nuts here and there. Grains probably came in there a little bit early, but we didn't really eat it in mass quantities prior to about 10,000 years ago. And so, we have to look at our assumption today is you need a balanced diet. You need to eat a little bit of every single food group, and you got to have a colorful rainbow colored plate, and you need to have 5 fruits and vegetables. Now it's 10 fruits and vegetables a day. We keep adding because, I would argue it's because we've emphasized an inferior source of food, and we've kind of went away from the most dense, nutritious source of food, which is animal source food. And since we've gone more and more plant-based, Americans eat about a 70% plant-based diet already.
Exactly.
We're already there. And so that, unfortunately, it's harder to get nutrition from plants. It just is, and I know people will argue with that, but I mean, it's pretty clear. It's difficult to extract the nutrients. The nutrients aren't always in the correct isoform that we need. We have to convert it. Some people do it better than others. Some people don't do it as well. There's anti-nutrients. There's fiber. It's hard to get some of the nutrition out when it's bound up in fiber. It's kind of interesting. If you look at the food stats in the United States from food that's wasted, 40% of all the food in the United States produced is wasted. It ends up in a landfill. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of that is fruits, vegetables, and baked goods. That's what ends up in these landfills. So we've got this production model. We're making all this, plant-based food. 40% of it's going in the trash. And then when we consume it, much of it ends up in the toilet, because it's all that fiber and it passes right through us. So it's like, is it really the most efficient source of nutrition? And I think that's an interesting question.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And, where do you fall then? Because, I know how I feel about this, but I'm sure like you were saying before, you catch heat from all these different groups when it comes to things like climate change. Do you feel that we're in that by eating more animal foods and, or eating solely animal foods, that we're becoming more part of the problem, or?
Yeah, that's a good topic. And I've spent a lot of time actually talking to people about this, because, most of us, we get our education about climate change from whatever we see on the news. Often we get it from these sort of propaganda-ish films that are highly skewed towards one way. And so there is no doubt whatsoever that animal agriculture does impact, global greenhouse gases. There's no doubt about it. They certainly produce that. So the question becomes, there's people out there that say, that man doesn't affect global change at all. I don't necessarily believe that. I think most of the scientists say, the global, climate change man is contributing to. And so if you believe that, and I think most people do, then you have to say, okay, so what's driving that? It is very clear when you look at the people that really understand this, they will say that fossil fuels are the prime driver of climate change. If you go back, even 100 years ago, and you look at the relative contributions of greenhouse gases, 100 years ago, animal agriculture was much higher relatively because we didn't have all these other industries. So now animal agriculture actually, over the last several decades, has actually declined as far as what they admit as far as greenhouse gases, particularly in the United States. The United States are, if we look at this, and I know there's concerns about how we raise the animals, but just from a solely carbon footprint, greenhouse gas footprint, and when we talk about that, we're talking about carbon equivalents. We're talking about methane, we're talking about nitrous oxide, we're talking about all these other things that are in there that all goes into this carbon equation. If we look at that, the numbers from 1970 to now are down about 20%. The water usage is down about 20%. The land usage is down about 20%. The feed usage is down about 20%. Our cattle industry, our cattle inventory in 1970 was about 130 million, I think. And now it's like 90. So we've dropped the number of animals we use. We produce more beef because of that, because we've better breeding practices, better ways to keep them healthy, better ways of predicting which animals will calf on time. Better feed efficiency. All those things have contributed to that. But more importantly, if we look at the numbers worldwide, according to the FAO, which is UN-based, they say that animal agriculture accounts for about 14% of the world's greenhouse gases. So that's not small potatoes. That's a decent amount, 14%. However, much of that, in fact, most of that contribution comes from underdeveloped countries like sub-Saharan Africa, some of the poor regions in Asia, where we have all these cattle and the efficiency practices are very, very poor. If we compare that so that's where most of those greenhouse gases are emitted. Now, if we go to the United States and we say, and the United States, by the way, is the largest producer of beef in the world, right? Our greenhouse gas footprint, in the United States, from cattle emit 1.9% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So all the greenhouse gas emissions that the United States makes, cattle only represents 1.9%. So if you and I and every American in the United States were to give up eating meat, right, and all those animals could vanish from the planet, if we could magically make them all go away, the impact on worldwide global greenhouse gas emissions would be 0.3%. It would be almost nothing. So, the rhetoric going out there that the best thing you can do for the environment is to stop eating meat is not true. That's the problem. Now, if you live in Sudan, and most of the industry is agriculture, there are a lot of rural things.
Right.
Then if you give up meat, you're going to have a bigger impact. But guess what? You're also going to starve to death.
Yes.
So we have to get in a position where we put this into the actual perspective, and so that's where there's a lot of political and sort of maneuvering that's going on here to try to sway you and I to say this is the best thing we can do for the environment. Should we continue to raise the standards across the world? Absolutely. Should we continue to improve efficiency? Absolutely, I think so. Should we continue to improve welfare of these animals? Absolutely, we should. Should we throw it all out and eat soy burgers or eat lab-grown meat, I seriously question that as a solution. I think there's problems with that. The other thing, people talk about, there's rainforest destruction in South America. That's absolutely true. And the animal agricultural industry contributes to that in Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. If you're living in Brazil, and there's some reasons for that. One, there's some corruption issues with Brazil. I mean, for anybody listening in Brazil, I think probably Brazil's got some wonderful people. There are some corruption issues in doing that. Sure. There are problems with the way they do it. They are actually getting a little bit better, where they're using less and less land. Much of that land is cleared for wood. I mean, they use the wood for furniture and building and all that stuff. So there's more reasons than just animal agriculture that go into that. But by you and I eating a hamburger in the United States, it has almost zero impact on deforestation in Brazil also. So you have to understand regional differences versus worldwide differences. Mm-hmm. The U.S. only imports about 0.4% of its beef comes from Brazil. So there's a tiny amount. In fact, it was banned up until a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. One of the things, when I talk to the cattle ranchers, and they've been pushing for this, is there's something they call it COOL. It's country of origin labeling. For a few years, they had that you could buy a pack of beef in the store. It would say, this is a product of this country. And, some people said, I only want to buy U.S. beef, or if I don't like U.S. beef, I only want to buy Canadian beef or Australian beef. But that was on there. That was available. Now that was taken away. And so now people can mix in beef from Brazil, beef from Mexico, beef from, wherever, mix it in a burger and not tell you where it's from. And so the farmers in the U.S. particularly, or the ranchers are particularly upset about that. But that was repealed, I think, in 2016. And so, there's something that if you're really worried about deforestation in Brazil, it'd be nice to know that you're not buying beef from Brazil. But that's the only way you're going to make a difference there. If you look at the forest worldwide, the actual data on forest in North America and Europe is actually the forest has recovered. There's actually more forest now than there was 100 years ago, which is kind of an interesting side note. Right. So I think we can't discount the environmental argument, but we have to understand it. They talk about water usage with cattle, right? One of the problems when they talk about it takes, 85 billion gallons of water to make an ounce of beef, some ridiculous number that they quote.
Exactly.
What they don't realize, or what people don't understand, is the vast majority of that is something called green water, and that's rainwater. Right. And what they say is, if a cow is standing in the field and it rains, all that water is accounted for the cow using. And now that rain would have occurred whether the cow was there or not. Yes. Right? And most of that rain goes in the ground. It's then reabsorbed and recycled into the atmosphere. They don't count that. So they have these funny ways of accounting it. And so I've talked to there's a guy named Frank Mittlaner, who's one of the world's leading experts on greenhouse gases. He's out of UC Davis, and I think he's been appointed as the CEO of the UN FAO organization for the next revision in 2020. So it'll be interesting. But he is highly critical of the way they've kind of rolled out this information. So so all the stats that you've been led to believe are really one-sided and manipulated. So it's very interesting. But I do think we have to be aware of that. But I mean, if you really want to save the planet, maybe an electric car, maybe ride your bike to work, or maybe maybe you take mass transit. I think that is a better that's a more viable solution to me than taking the entire population and taking nutrition away from them. I think that's a recipe for disaster. Yeah. Healthcare. The healthcare industry contributes 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So if you and I are not sick, Adrian, if you and I are not spending our time in the hospital, we're not contributing to that greenhouse gas emission. But if you and I are sick and diabetic and all these other things, and we're in there getting our toes amputated, or whatever, God forbid, happens, we're contributing to greenhouse gases that way. So the question becomes, what's more important? Does the 1.9% of greenhouse gases that cows emit, is that as much as the 10% that hospitals admit? Right. So that's you got to put it in big picture perspective. Right.
Well, the other thing that I was thinking while you were talking is that when my husband and I first started dating, his previous girlfriend was a vegetarian, and he had no shortage of methane gas stories from this woman. She was so gassy from her diet, and I kind of wonder, is transferring it from cattle, for example, to humans, is that going to make a difference? Because
well,
you see what I'm saying?
And honestly, there's actually been studies done on that. And really, I mean, it's funny to talk about, but honestly, human methane emissions is really inconsequential. I mean, really, it's not a valid argument. It's kind of a funny argument to make, but vegans up there having, gas emissions all over the place is not going to impact global warming that much. Now, I would argue you
get enough of them.
Well, even enough of them. I mean, it's still, if you look at cattle emissions or anything else, or even horse emissions, because this is another thing people don't talk about. We have 9 million horses in the United States, right? And they're emitting methane, and they're going through feed, and they're but nobody wants to get rid of the horses, but we've got 9 million dairy cattle, and we've got the same amount of cows making milk, but we want to get rid of those guys. So the people that are calling for animal the abolition of animal agriculture don't say anything about the horses. We've got 140 million cats and dogs in the United States. Cats and dogs take up enough food resources to feed about 70 million people. No one's talking about, we got to get rid of cats and dogs. So, I mean, these people, they're very selective on how they want to enforce sort of the how we deal with animals. But back to the methane thing, this is an argument that I would make. I don't think digestion should involve bloating and gas and pain. I don't think that's a normal function, right? Yeah. You wouldn't say if I was breathing and it was painful for me to breathe, or I was wheezing or coughing, no one would say that's normal respiration. If you were, if your circulatory system, if you had pain in your blood vessels or claudication or chest pain, no one is going to say that is a normal part of human, cardiac function, right? Or so. But the fact that we accept pain and discomfort during digestion and say, that's just normal, I don't think we're designed that way. I really don't. And I mean, there are people, vegan activists, that say, no, that's just normal. Humans grew up outside; they were farting all the time, and that's normal. I don't believe that. I think you're not supposed to have pain. And this is one of the things that people that go on a carnivore diet, they've almost, particularly once they've kind of transitioned, past the first couple of weeks, they say, I never even notice digestion anymore. I rarely have gas. I barely even fart. So I think that is probably more in line of how we're designed. If we look at the fermentative capacity of animals, and there's studies, there's a nice study out of 1978, which I just posted on Instagram today, that talks about the fermentative capacity of cows and sheep and pigs and dogs and cats and humans. Cows have about 85% fermentative capacity based on their digestive anatomy. Pigs have about 50% fermentative capacity. When I say fermentative capacity, that basically means the ability to deal with plant fibers, to ferment those plant fibers into short-chain fatty acids. Dogs and cats contain about 15 to 16%. Humans contain about 15 to 16%. So we're very much aligned with cat and dog anatomy as far as percentage and ability to ferment these plant products. And so we have, you saw alpha. I mean, we evolved alongside a lot of these dogs. And so we had kind of a similar diet. And if you look at what a dog's natural diet is, it's a wolf's natural diet. And a wolf in the woods is not out eating they're certainly not eating tofu, and they're not eating blueberries, and they're not eating grains. I mean, they might eat grass when they want to throw up, but beyond that, I mean, they eat meat. I mean, and so I think there's some pretty good clues that show us what we're mostly designed for.
And I think that another thing that's missing from that ecological argument is that so much of the landmass of the planet is in areas where you can't farm vegetables. And, grazing, particularly sheep and goats on some of these rocky hillside areas is proving to be very beneficial for, people who live in those areas because they're eating down that grass. And I've told this story before on the podcast. When I was in France over a decade ago now, we stayed at a farm that was located in the hills somewhere in central France. And the farmers there were telling me that during the summer, many of the sheep and goat farmers have their animals basically flown up to like these really high Alp regions where they eat down the grass and they nourish the soil so that it prevents avalanche during the winter months. Because between, agitating the soil and making it hospitable to microbiota and to, absorbing fluids, as well as not providing this kind of grassy slick for the melting ice to slide off of. It was preventing avalanche issues, and it's been a while since I've heard of some avalanche in Europe, to be honest.
Yeah, there is a lot of work, guys like Alan Savory, Joel Salatin, and other people, they're big advocates of, what they call regenerative pasturing. And I think there's certainly a significant role for that. And I think we should explore that and utilize that when and where we can. Not all farming situations or ranching situations are amenable to that from what I understand. If you're a Montana, if you're raising cattle in Montana in the winter, sometimes the weather sort of changes what you can do. But you're absolutely right. I think we do have to take account of the soil. I mean, the soil can be a carbon sink. I mean, there's some estimates that they can mitigate about 20% of the carbon that's emitted from the animal. So I think that is definitely a good thing, and we need to include that. And it's an important part of the story that's left out. They don't, when they talk about carbon emissions, they don't talk at all about soil sequestration of carbon. And I think that is a part of the equation. These animals have always been part of our ecosystem, and I think they need to be there. Now, we can argue that there's better or worse ways to do that, and I think that argument is playing out. But I think, the answer is not, in my view, to grow these big monocrops, because there's a push now for this. There's two things going on. There's, we're going to eat these fake meats that are made out of soybeans or pea protein or wheat gluten, and I think that's just a disaster for human health.
Totally.
I think no one should be eating that garbage. I mean, this Beyond Meat, in my view, is beyond stupid. That's what I've said. But then people say, well, let's go to this. This lab grown, this synthetic meat stuff. And so I think there are some problems with that as well. And I think maybe it turns out it's fine and that may be a solution for some people. I think there's a lot of people that are just not going to do it because they're worried about it. But I think there's significant concerns around that industry as well. I mean, right now, the medium that they have to grow these cells in is bovine fetal serum. And so they have to kill a pregnant cow, harvest the fetus, get the blood, and continue to do that over and over again to get enough to grow these animals. So it's not free of any animal death at all,
right.
But, assuming they get past that, maybe they'll develop a serum that they can do it. Right now, they have to continue to soak these things in an antibiotic medium. So you guys that are worried about antibiotics, these things are continuously soaked in antibiotics to keep them viable. They're giving all kinds of growth promoting factors, which we aren't sure how they impact the human physiology yet. So we don't know about that. There's also, this sort of, how do we keep these cells alive? Well, you have these these immortal lines, and that's the same thing they do with tumor cells. So they have these tumors that have been breast cancer cells that have been around since the 1960s. They keep growing them over and over and over again. So the question is there a problem with those cells and eating those types of things? We don't know the answer to that yet. And so, there's again, the other thing is, they need amino acids to produce protein.
Right.
A cow will take, they'll munch on some grass, which you and I can't eat. They'll munch on, most of that. They'll turn that inedible stuff, that inedible protein, into food that we can actually eat now. Now, to get those amino acids, they have to harvest it from some sort of plant source. And typically what they likely will use are things like peas or soybeans. So you have these vast monocropped areas of peas and soybeans to produce the protein that goes into feeding these factories that's then being converted into this, this chemical mixture that we'll one day call synthetic meat. And, they like to call the term clean meat. Actually, that term has been outlawed. They can't call it clean meat anymore because the industry said no, because, by calling that clean meat, you imply everybody else's meat is dirty, which I think it was appropriate that they fought that term. So it can no longer be called clean meat. At least it can't be labeled that way. But so we've got that, that coming on, it may be, I fully expect that to come to fruition. I think that will happen. Whether or not that's healthy for the planet, whether it's healthy for human physiology, we probably won't know for 50 years. And so for those people that are willing to take that experiment, you will know soon. But I mean, it's concerning to me that I see, this sort of acceptance that we're all just going to go there without even thinking
about it. Exactly. That's kind of how we got into this mess in the first place.
Right. I mean, we accepted the low fat dogma and the food pyramid, and we didn't question it. It was what was his name? McGovern, was sitting there. I don't have time for science. I'm a politician. I got to make a decision now, right? I mean, that was his famous line. When then we adopted the food pyramid, and then arguably we've had some problems with that since then. But to say we're going to all go plant-based, we're all going to eat this synthetic meat for those that want to still eat meat, I think that we really need to question that, and we really need to sort of have people that will step up and say, wait a minute, this is the nice thing about this carnivore diet. Not that I advocate everyone do it or anyone even do it. I mean, I think you do it if you want to, and I'm happy to help you with that. But I think what we're seeing with the carnivore diet is that meat has been demonized based on mostly epidemiology, with really bad confounded epidemiology, which shows that, hey, I'm a meat eater, but guess what? I'm also eating French fries and sucking down Cokes and eating the smoothies and Frosties. And so we've never really been able to separate that out, right? So now we've got these people that are just eating a carnivore diet. They're only eating meat. They're not eating the rest of that crap. And guess what's happening? They're losing weight. They're getting leaner. Their blood pressure's getting better. Their digestion's getting better. Their high sensitivity C-reactive proteins normalizing. Their glucose is stabilizing. They're getting cardiac calcium scans like I did, and it's zero. We're seeing all these sort of really healthful things coming out of that. And so you have to start to step back and say, wait a minute, maybe meat's not the bad guy. Maybe it's all the that we've put in the diet since, 1910, the Crisco and the high fructose corn syrup that came in the 70s, and the processed, the Snackwells and all this garbage and all the preservatives and all the added, whatever we've got in there, this chemical mishmash. Maybe that's actually the problem. And it's not something we've been eating naturally for gazillions of years. And so I think that's really the nice thing about this diet. We're hopefully going to get some studies out of this. I mean, that is starting to take off now. I think there's people that they're taking upon themselves. Hopefully I can help facilitate that. Hopefully even the beef industry itself, I think, should fund some of these studies. I mean, even there's going to be people criticism, but I think these studies need to be done. And if they won't fund it, right now there's people that are doing this that are willing to self-pay for their test, and it's happening, and I think it's going to continue to happen. And I think it's fun to see.
What's your stance on quality? Do you differentiate between the GMO meat that we have here in Hawaii versus pastured meat?
So that's a very interesting and controversial topic. So clearly there are nutritional differences on paper for somebody that says I only eat grass-finished beef that's antibiotic-free and hormone-free versus I just eat whatever I can afford. And so I think there is you have to have the discussion of what is practical for most people. Right. And so what I have seen, just observing now thousands of people, I have not seen a big difference in a general sense. I mean, there's just as many people that are reversing their diseases, eating what they can afford, even though if it's not the high-end, most expensive stuff, versus people that don't have access and the financial means to buy that other stuff. So I've not seen a big clinical difference. Now, on paper, you could say, well, grass-finished beef has a little more zinc. It has a little more favorable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. It has a little bit more conjugated linoleic acid. There are things that make you say that maybe it might be more beneficial, but we haven't formally tested that yet. Now, it is kind of interesting that there was a couple studies done on grass-finished versus grain-finished beef done by Texas A&M University several years ago, and they were looking at things like blood pressure and cholesterol and lipid markers. And actually, the grain-finished came out just slightly more favorable. Really? Not that it was any big deal, and it's just one study, and I don't put too much faith in that. But so I haven't seen a huge difference in human health. Now, again, different arguments about ethics, different arguments about the environment. I think there's bigger fish to fry, quite honestly. If you're worried about some microscopic nanogram quantity of estrogen that might show up in an antibiotic implanted animal, this is an interesting statistic. If you eat, as a male, I'm a male, so if I make estrogen, as a male, I mean, you make testosterone, I make some estrogen, it's different amounts because we're different sexes, but as a male, I make a certain amount of estrogen every day. Hopefully I make more testosterone, but the amount that I make every day, for me to get that much from beef that has been implanted, I would have to eat 27 cows a day. I mean, 27 entire cows to get what I naturally would make. So it's really a tiny amount. And even if I were to eat cows that do not get implants, I would still get a small amount from that because the cows still make natural hormones. I mean, just like you and I do. Oh, yeah. So you're still getting some in there anyway. So again, does it make sense to worry about 1% when the big picture? I'm not eating the sugar. I'm not eating the crappy fried food and vegetable oils. I'm not eating the Twinkies and the Oreos. what's more important. And so I think people get so hung up on these tiny, tiny minor things, and make a big deal out of that when they should be looking at the big picture. And that's what I really like to look back and say, what is the big picture here? Right. And, we can argue about, animal ethics and those things. That's a different discussion. But when we just limit it to human health, and what you can afford as a person, where in Hawaii are you, by the way?
Big Island.
Big Island. I was there.
And by the way, not all of our meat is GMO'd. It's just there's some ranchers you were talking about. The basically truth in labeling of right. meat, and that's my beef with them. No pun intended. Is that many of them they're raising their animals actually on the mainland, and they are being fed nothing but GMO corn and soy, and then they ship 10% back and sell the rest on the mainland and say that it's Hawaii beef. So I've got multiple issues with that.
Yeah, there are, it's kind of funny because, people, they'll shell out big bucks for something that says grass finished or grass fed. And, you don't know what you're really getting. I mean, the laws around that are very easy to circumvent. It just means,
exactly.
If you say the animal's grass finished, it means it has access to grass.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean they ate it, It doesn't mean, and it's also, there's exception for weather. If it's cold out, and it's snowing and there's no grass, well, guess what? They're going to get fed something else. So, I mean, again, that's why I really, these people that are spending all this money on this stuff, I sometimes say, well, you don't even know what you're really getting. So does it actually make a difference? So it's important. I think we need to do those studies. I think we need to do these randomized control trials on people eating, grass-fed versus grain-fed versus antibiotic versus GMO. Those studies need to be done in humans to really get a sense of what we're doing. And I think, it's just a matter of who wants to do it, who wants to fund it. It's very easy to say this sort of makes me nervous, and I think that's fine. But I mean, again, the same thing with the synthetic lab meat. When that comes out, I just have a sort of a cognitive bias that I think that to me doesn't sound like a good idea, but it may turn out it's perfectly fine, right. And I'm willing to accept that. But I think that those studies need to be done, and they need to be convincingly done before I would say, this is what we need to do. And again, that's aside the other environmental issues, the monocropping and all the other crap that goes into that. So, I mean, there's so many facets and levels of this stuff that it's hard just to get hung up on one issue and without considering all these other variables that go into that.
This concludes part 1 of our interview with Dr. Shawn Baker. Join us next week when we will delve more into the consequences of modern food sourcing, the heresy on meat seasoning, and the most elusive aspect of being a carnivore, pooping. That's next week on the Nutrition Heretic Podcast.
The Nutrition Heretic Podcast is a production of Savor the Journey, LLC. Our audio editor is Nikola Popovich. Our podcast manager is Crystal McLean, and our operations manager is Michelle Med. I'm your host, Adrian Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic. You can find us at the new and improved nutritionheretic.com, where you can download the Nutrition Heretic's free shit list of 7 health foods to avoid like the plague. You can also listen to previous episodes at nutritionheretic.com/podcast. Be sure to like us on social media for updates. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/nutritionheretic and on Twitter @NutriHeretic. Contact us with show ideas, questions, or if you want to be a guest. And don't forget to rate our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher.